Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a battle or a banquet, but with the very personal, very peculiar world of pets in ancient China. We're stepping into a time when cats were government officials, dogs wore silk pajamas, and your neighbour might literally keep a cricket as entertainment and call it normal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In ancient China, pets weren't just companions. They were status symbols, spiritual guardians, government employees, and, occasionally, dinner. But not too often, thankfully. The Chinese relationship with animals was complex, deeply rooted in philosophy, superstition, and the practical realities of daily life. Unlike medieval Europe, where animals were often viewed with suspicion or purely as livestock, ancient China developed sophisticated ideas about the spiritual and emotional bonds between humans and their animal companions. This doesn't mean everyone wandered around like an ancient Disney princess with birds perched on their shoulders. People still had practical concerns, like keeping their grain stores free of rodents and their homes protected from intruders. But the full emotional bond with pets became common, reserved not just for the very wealthy, but for merchants, scholars, and even some farmers who could afford an extra mouth to feed. So yes, ancient Chinese people loved their pets, but not because they were sentimental or overly attached. They were trying, in their own Han Dynasty way, to maintain cosmic balance, ward off evil spirits, and occasionally show off their wealth. Unfortunately, without modern veterinary care, pet insurance, or a basic grasp of animal psychology, the strategy was more superstition than science. Once upon a time in a dynasty that didn't yet smell like incense and regret, the domestic cat was not just a furry companion, but a small whiskered government official. Inspired by the practical need to protect grain stores from rodents, ancient Chinese cats offered pest control, spiritual protection, and a hint of elegance. These were creatures where scholars could observe, emperors could pamper, and common folk could actually afford to keep. Cats arrived in China sometime during the Han Dynasty, around 200 BCE, probably via the Silk Road trade routes. Unlike dogs, which had been domesticated in China for millennia, cats were relative newcomers, but they adapted quickly to Chinese sensibilities, particularly their supposed ability to see spirits and ward off supernatural threats. Then things got mystical in the best way. By the Tang Dynasty, cats had acquired a reputation for being spiritually sensitive. They could supposedly see ghosts, demons, and other supernatural entities that were invisible to humans. This wasn't just folklore, it was practical theology. A house cat that suddenly stared at an empty corner or hissed at nothing was providing an early warning system for spiritual intrusions. It didn't take long for the imperial court to get involved. Cats became fashionable among the wealthy, who bred them for specific traits like colour, size and temperament. White cats were particularly prized, as white was associated with purity and good fortune. Black cats, contrary to European superstitions, were also considered lucky in China. But it wasn't just superstition that made cats valuable. They were genuinely effective at rodent control, which was crucial in a civilization that depended heavily on stored grain. A good mouser could mean the difference between a prosperous year and famine. Cats weren't just pets, they were agricultural insurance policies with whiskers. Meanwhile, in the imperial palaces, cats quietly adapted to lives of luxury. Many had designated sleeping areas, specialized diets, and even personal servants. Some imperial cats wore silk collars and had their own heating braziers during winter. It was less about being a pet and more about being a small furry aristocrat. But it wasn't just luxury and mouse catching that defined Chinese cats. They became subjects of art, literature, and philosophy. Poets wrote verses about their grace and independence. Artists painted their portraits alongside scholars and courtesans. Even Confucian scholars debated the proper relationship between humans and cats, concluding that cats represented the ideal balance between independence and loyalty. Despite all the attention from emperors and poets, cats maintained their essential catness. Ancient Chinese sources are full of complaints about cats knocking over ink pots, stealing food, and generally behaving like cats. Some things never change, apparently. Despite the widespread belief that a pampered pet could bring good fortune, and the imperial court's growing fascination with exotic animals, ancient Chinese people didn't completely abandon the idea of practical pet ownership. They just turned it into something you'd do when you needed reliable companionship, effective pest control, or a living status symbol. Let's begin with dogs. Yes, wealthy people kept dogs, though not so often that their silk cushions got permanently covered in fur. They had servants tend to the animals because indoor plumbing for pets was still centuries away. Dogs were bathed regularly, fed cooked meat and rice, and often slept in special wooden houses designed to match the architectural style of their owner's home. This wasn't so much pet ownership, as it was maintaining a small barking extension of your household. The bathing was often done by servants in courtyards, using warm water scented with herbs like chrysanthemum or jasmine. Privacy was optional, depending on your level of wealth or how much you trusted your servants not to gossip about your dog's behaviour. Some dogs even shared living spaces with their owners, particularly small breeds like the Pekingese, which were so tiny they could fit in the sleeves of court robes. What's more romantic than carrying your dog around like a furry accessory while conducting imperial business? The poor kept dogs too, but usually as working animals first and companions second. These dogs guarded property, herded livestock, or helped with hunting. It wasn't about emotional bonding, it was about survival. Might as well train the dog to guard the chickens and warn us about strangers, was probably said more than once in ancient Chinese villages. In winter, pet care took a backseat to human survival. So instead of elaborate grooming and special diets, people turned to a strategy known as keep the animal alive and hope for the best. A few specialised pet shops existed in major cities like Chang'an and Kaifeng, where wealthy customers could purchase rare breeds, exotic birds, or specialised pet accessories. These weren't just stores, they were social gathering places where pet enthusiasts could show off their animals and exchange care tips. For special occasions like festivals or family celebrations, pets would receive extra attention. New collars, special meals, or even tiny outfits were not uncommon. Because nothing says we're celebrating the moon festival like dressing your cat in miniature silk robes. When full-body pampering became standard among the wealthy, thanks to the belief that well-cared-for pets reflected their owner's virtue and prosperity, the ancient Chinese world turned to the next best thing, the humble pet grooming session. Except they didn't really have professional pet groomers, at least not the kind you can find at any modern pet store. Instead, they used household servants, family members, or occasionally Buddhist monks who had taken vows of compassion toward all living creatures. Grooming in this context meant more than just brushing. It involved careful attention to the animal's spiritual as well as physical well-being. Pets were bathed with water that had been blessed by Taoist priests or infused with herbs believed to ward off evil spirits. Their fur was brushed with combs made from precious materials like ivory or jade, not just for luxury, but because these materials were thought to have protective properties. These grooming sessions focused on more than just appearance. The process was seen as a form of meditation, both for the pet and the owner. Confucian scholars wrote about the proper way to care for animals, emphasizing patience, gentleness, and respect for the creature's natural dignity. For wealthier households, professional animal caregivers might travel between homes offering specialised services. These weren't veterinarians in the modern sense, but they understood animal behaviour and basic care. They might examine a pet's eyes, check its teeth, and provide advice about diet and exercise. And if you were a monk, you probably had a better pet care routine than most. Many Buddhist and Taoist monasteries kept animals as part of their spiritual practice. The care of these creatures was seen as an expression of compassion and a way to accumulate good karma. Monks would often spend hours grooming and caring for temple cats, dogs and birds, treating the work as a form of prayer. Either way, the result was the same: a carefully tended animal, a sense of spiritual accomplishment, and a renewed appreciation for the bond between human and pet. So no, it wasn't glamorous, but it worked. More or less. At least until you had to explain to visitors why your cat was wearing a tiny jade collar and refusing to catch mice because it had gotten too accustomed to being hand-fed. If ancient Chinese pet hair had a motto, it would probably be ornamental but functional. Contrary to popular belief, people didn't just let their animals' coats grow wild and matted like tiny walking tumbleweed. They did in fact groom their pets regularly, just not frequently enough to prevent the occasional fur-related household disaster, and certainly not with anything resembling modern pet shampoo. So what did they use? A variety of homemade concoctions that sounded like the first draft of an alchemical recipe. One popular choice was rice water mixed with ground eggshells and chrysanthemum petals, which was great for adding shine and also making your pet smell like a fancy tea ceremony. Pair that with water of dubious purity, and you've got yourself an ancient Chinese pet spa treatment. For those hoping to preserve their pet's coat a little longer, various herbal infusions were sometimes used as rinses. Ingredients like ginseng, lotus root, and green tea were mixed with warm water. And yes, that meant sitting in a drafty courtyard with herbal tea slowly dripping down your dog's back, while trying to convince yourself this was improving the animal's qi. Others used more practical solutions. Simple brushing with bamboo or wooden combs was routine, often accompanied by the burning of incense to create a calming atmosphere. Some pet grooming recipes included vinegar infusions with mint or rose petals, which did double duty. They cleaned the coat and gave the animal a pleasant scent that covered up other, less appealing odours. But let's be clear, no one was shampooing and conditioning twice. This was more of a targeted splash and scrub operation. Water temperature also mattered. Hot water was believed to overstimulate the animal's internal energy, while cold water could shock the system. Lukewarm was the sweet spot, assuming you had fuel to heat it, and didn't mind waiting 3 hours for a basin of bath water that the household children hadn't already used for their own washing. Brushing, on the other hand, was routine. Combs made of bone, wood, or precious materials were common and often elaborately carved. A rare moment of elegance in an otherwise practical reality. And people took pride in well-groomed pets. Wealthy families in particular might spend considerable time getting their animals' coats perfectly arranged, all while hoping a nearby cooking fire didn't undo their hard work with one rogue spark. Dental care for pets in ancient China was less sparkling smile and more, still has most of its teeth, what's your excuse? Now, to their credit, ancient Chinese people didn't entirely ignore animal oral health. They didn't exactly understand it either, but they made a solid effort using what they had, which was mostly observation, herbal remedies, and blind hope. There were no pet toothbrushes. That innovation was still centuries away. Instead, people used soft cloth rags to clean their pets' teeth, ideally soaked in something mildly abrasive, like salt water or herbal tea. The goal wasn't whitening, it was survival. If your dog's breath didn't knock you over, you were already winning. Some pet owners opted for chewing aids, raw bones from chicken or fish, carefully prepared to avoid splintering. You chew until the bone was cleaned, then gnaw on it some more to exercise the jaw muscles. Think of it as the original biodegradable dog toy, organic, compostable, and surprisingly effective at cleaning teeth. To freshen breath, animals were sometimes given herbs like mint, fennel, or licorice root to chew on. In wealthier circles, pets might have their mouths rinsed with diluted wine or herbal infusions, because nothing says dental sophistication like giving your cat a wine rinse. And if you're wondering about pet toothpaste, it did sort of exist. Some recipes included powdered charcoal, crushed pearls, and ground fish bones mixed with honey to form a gritty paste. If your pet's mouth didn't feel cleaner afterward, it at least felt thoroughly scoured. Now, veterinarians, if you could call them that, were usually doctors who occasionally treated animals on the side. If a tooth was loose, infected, or just causing problems, the solution was often herbal treatment or, in extreme cases, removal. No anesthesia, no detailed examination, just a firm grip and a prayer to the gods of animal welfare. Aftercare included rinsing with herbal teas and hoping the animal's natural healing abilities kicked in before infection set in. Despite all this, ancient Chinese pets weren't necessarily suffering from poor dental health. Diets were often more natural than modern processed pet food, and many animals had decent oral health simply because they ate bones, chewed on appropriate materials, and weren't consuming the sugary treats that plague modern pets. But when dental problems did occur, they occurred fast, and the only treatment strong enough to fix serious issues was patience, herbal medicine, and possibly divine intervention. Let's be honest, if you time travelled to a bustling ancient Chinese marketplace, your first reaction wouldn't be awe at the architectural beauty. It would be wondering why everything smelled like a combination of incense, cooking oil, animal musk, and something vaguely fishy that you couldn't quite identify. Because ancient China smelled committed to being an unforgettable sensory experience. There was no modern waste management, no pet deodorizers, and very few functioning public baths for animals, which meant the average street smelled like a combination of human activity, livestock, cooking fires, and the accumulated scent of thousands of pets living in close quarters with their owners. If your nose survived a trip through the bird market and passed the dog breeder's quarter, congratulations, you'd already done better than most foreign visitors. So how did people deal with this olfactory chaos? They got creative. Enter the pet perfume industry, which was basically small containers of scented oils and herbal mixtures applied to animals before public appearances. These were rubbed onto fur, mixed into bathing water, or simply sprinkled around pet sleeping areas like an ancient Chinese version of Febreze. These scent enhancers were stuffed with ingredients like sandalwood, jasmine, chrysanthemum, or musk from various animals. Often they were carried in tiny silk pouches that could be attached to collars or placed near pet bedding. Think of it as giving your pet a portable air freshener, only it didn't neutralize odors so much as politely compete with them. Ladies often applied scented oils directly to their pet's fur, both to improve the animal's smell and to demonstrate their wealth and refinement. Some even braided aromatic herbs directly into their dog's fur, or attached tiny incense burners to larger animals' collars. It was equal parts hygiene, fashion, and spiritual pest control. For those with sufficient funds, imported perfumes were available from India or Central Asia, made from exotic ingredients like frankincense, myrrh, or rare flower essences. Applying these involved dabbing, massaging, and pretending you weren't just covering up the stench of an animal that had been rolling in who knows what behind the stables. And then there were the environmental smells. Open sewers, cooking fires, incense from temples, and whatever the local butcher had just disposed of in the street. Cities were often enveloped in a fog of mixed aromas, but no one really complained because everyone was experiencing the same nasal adventure together. It was communal suffering, with notes of sandalwood and fish sauce. The wealthy encouraged spiritual cleanliness for their pets through ritual baths and blessings, but physical scent was often left largely to chance and herbal intervention. If your animal smelled decent, people assumed you were prosperous or spiritually enlightened. If it didn't, you were just blending in with everyone else's aromatic menagerie. If you've ever owned a pet and spent a day nervously checking whether it needed a bath, imagine doing that for your entire relationship with the animal. Except no one had pet shampoo, and everyone's pets smelled like they'd been rolling in incense and fish for 3 days straight. Welcome to ancient China, where pet odour wasn't just a possibility, it was an identity. There were no commercial pet deodorizers, no air fresheners, and certainly no professional pet grooming services with industrial-strength cleaning products. People simply lived with pet smells and then made peace with them, sort of. To mask or manage the musk, people employed various tricks. One common method was burning specific types of incense in rooms where pets spent time. Sandalwood, jasmine, and lotus-scented incense were popular choices, not because they eliminated odours, but because they created a more pleasant overall atmosphere. Others used herbal sachets placed strategically around pet bedding or living areas. These contained dried flowers, aromatic woods, and sometimes ground spices. The logic was simple. If you can't eliminate the pet smell, at least try to make the environment smell like a temple. In fact, scented collars and accessories were common among wealthy pet owners, mostly so they could maintain some olfactory dignity while walking their animals through crowded streets. No one wanted their pet to smell terrible, but everyone understood that animals would smell like animals. Ancient Chinese medicine also played its part in pet odour management. Practitioners believed that strong odours from animals could indicate imbalances in the creature's internal energy or diet. So addressing pet smell wasn't just about comfort, it was about ensuring the animal's spiritual and physical health. You were expected to accept that pets would have their own distinctive scents, work to minimise offensive odours, and focus on the emotional and spiritual benefits of animal companionship. You weren't neglecting your pet, you were just accepting the natural order of things while doing your best to keep the household pleasant. Then there was the fashion problem. Pets living in close quarters with their owners, often sleeping on the same furniture or even in the same beds, meant that human clothing and pet smells became thoroughly intertwined. Combine that with cooking fires, incense, and the occasional festival celebration, and you had yourself a sensory experience worthy of careful navigation. But hey, you weren't alone. Everyone around you had pets that smelled. Even the emperor, even the Buddhist monks, even the woman selling you vegetables who kept 3 cats in her shop to control rodents. In short, pet deodorizers weren't real, but shared acceptance of natural animal scents absolutely was. In a world without modern pet hygiene products, professional grooming services, or deodorizers that didn't involve burning something aromatic, ancient Chinese people turned to an unlikely hero in their pet care routine: silk and cotton textiles. Not to eat off of, but to wrap around their animals, preferably as clothing that was changed before it developed its own ecosystem. Textile pet accessories were the unsung saviours of ancient Chinese animal care. Breathable, washable, and surprisingly durable, they were worn by pets belonging to wealthy families and served multiple purposes: protection from weather, status display, and a barrier between the animal's fur and everything else in the household. Pet clothing in ancient China included everything from simple cotton wraps to elaborate silk robes with embroidered designs. Small dogs like Pekingese often wore tiny jackets during winter, complete with sleeves and decorative trim. These weren't just adorable fashion statements, they were practical necessities for animals bred to be small and delicate. The logic was elegant: dress the pet appropriately rather than constantly bathing it, because bathing an animal was labour-intensive and potentially stressful for the creature. But washing and changing pet clothing, perfectly manageable, especially if you had servants to handle the laundry. People might go weeks without giving their pets full baths, but they would change the animal's outer garments regularly, sometimes even daily for prized pets, which by ancient Chinese standards was practically obsessive cleanliness. Silk was so respected for pet clothing that it became a status signal. If your dog was wearing clean, well-made silk garments, people assumed you had both wealth and proper values. If the animal was dressed in rough, dirty cotton, well, you were either poor, practically minded, or recently bereaved. For working animals, clothing served different purposes. Guard dogs might wear leather vests for protection during conflicts. Hunting dogs had specialized gear designed for specific terrains and weather conditions. Even farm cats sometimes wore simple cloth wraps to protect them from parasites or harsh weather. Of course, making pet clothing wasn't simple. It involved measuring the animal, cutting fabric to accommodate 4 legs and a tail, and creating fasteners that wouldn't interfere with the creature's movement or comfort. Specialized pet tailors existed in larger cities, catering to wealthy customers who wanted custom garments for their animals. If there was one thing truly consistent in the ancient Chinese pet care routine, it was dealing with parasites. Not because people were allergic to cleanliness or proper hygiene, though let's be honest, probably that too, but because they were constantly battling an entire travelling circus of fleas, ticks and mites that treated pet fur like a luxury resort. Fleas were such an everyday nuisance that they were basically treated like unwanted but inevitable house guests. You didn't get rid of fleas, you just managed fleas. Everyone's pets had them. Rich, poor, imperial, common. Fleas didn't discriminate. They were the true equalizers of ancient Chinese society. So what did people do? Well, for starters, they used flea combs, often made of fine-toothed bone, wood, or metal. These were common household items, like chopsticks are today. Except instead of picking up food, you were extracting tiny jumping insects from your pet's fur, like some kind of miniature, frustrating harvest. These combs had closely packed teeth designed to catch and remove adult fleas, their eggs, and whatever else was living rent-free in your animal's coat. The process required patience, good lighting, and the acceptance that you'd probably never get them all. Another method involved herbal baths or rinses. Ingredients like wormwood, chrysanthemum, and bitter orange peel were steeped in hot water and used to wash pets. The strong scents and natural compounds in these plants were believed to repel insects, though their effectiveness was probably more hopeful than scientific. And then there was the classic technique of environmental management, keeping pet bedding clean, burning specific types of incense, and regularly cleaning areas where animals spent time. If you couldn't eliminate the fleas entirely, you could at least make their living conditions less appealing. Some pet owners used powdered substances like ground sulfur or herbal mixtures dusted into pet fur. These treatments were messy, potentially irritating, and of questionable effectiveness, but they represented genuine attempts to solve the problem. But the real solution was endurance and acceptance. Everyone's pets had fleas. Everyone dealt with the constant scratching. It was part of life, like seasonal festivals, tax collection, or stepping in something unpleasant near the market stalls. The wealthy had more resources to throw at the problem, better grooming tools, higher quality herbal treatments, and servants dedicated to pet care. But even imperial pets dealt with parasites. It was simply a fact of life that transcended social class. Ah, the ancient Chinese pet toilet, a term that feels optimistic because, in truth, pet waste management in ancient China was less about designated facilities and more about creative cleanup strategies and dramatically lowered expectations. Let's start with the wealthy. Palatial homes and wealthy households had designated areas for pet relief, usually courtyards or gardens with sand, gravel, or specially prepared earth that could absorb waste and be easily cleaned. These weren't elaborate facilities, just practical spaces where animals could do their business without creating major household crises. Servants were typically responsible for cleaning these areas, removing waste, and maintaining basic sanitation. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was essential for maintaining a pleasant living environment, especially when pets lived in close quarters with their human families. Common people, on the other hand, had fewer luxuries. Most pets simply used outdoor areas, courtyards, alleys, or designated spots near homes. In rural areas, pet waste often became part of the general agricultural cycle, used as fertilizer for crops or gardens. For nighttime needs, smaller pets might use containers filled with sand or earth, similar to modern litter boxes, but considerably more primitive. These required daily cleaning and regular replacement of the absorbent material. Urban areas presented more challenges. Cities had designated waste collection areas, but pet waste management was largely left to individual households. Street cleaning was handled by municipal workers, though the definition of clean was considerably more flexible than modern standards. And what did people use for cleanup? Cloth rags, wooden scrapers, and lots of water when it was available. For solid waste, the approach was straightforward. Remove it quickly and dispose of it in designated areas or use it for agricultural purposes. Wealthy households might have servants whose job included pet waste management, but for most people, it was just another household chore to be shared among family members. The key was developing routines and maintaining realistic expectations. Pets were going to create messes. The goal was managing those messes efficiently and preventing them from becoming health hazards or social embarrassments. Before everyone collectively decided that keeping exotic pets was a mark of sophistication and possibly a path to spiritual enlightenment, pet ownership in ancient China was actually quite diverse and included creatures that would make modern pet owners question their life choices. Birds were incredibly popular, not just as pets but as status symbols and artistic inspiration. Wealthy households often kept aviaries filled with songbirds, parrots, and other exotic species imported from Southeast Asia and beyond. These weren't just decoration. They were living art pieces that demonstrated their owner's wealth, taste, and cultural sophistication. Crickets occupied a special place in Chinese pet culture. Yes, crickets. These insects were kept in elaborate cages, prized for their songs, and even used in organised fighting competitions. Cricket keeping became so sophisticated that specialised markets sold different varieties, along with custom-made cages and feeding equipment. The cricket fighting scene was serious business. People would train their insects, develop feeding strategies to improve their fighting ability, and place substantial bets on matches. It was like ancient Chinese mixed martial arts, but with insects that fit in your palm. Fish keeping also flourished, particularly goldfish, which were selectively bred for colour and fin shape. The Chinese developed some of the earliest ornamental fish breeding programs, creating varieties that are still popular today. Goldfish weren't just pets, they were living demonstrations of human ability to improve upon nature through careful selection and breeding. Some wealthy households kept more exotic animals, monkeys, deer, and various imported species that served as conversation pieces and status symbols. These animals required specialised care and often had dedicated servants responsible for their well-being. Rabbits were kept both as pets and as livestock, depending on the household's needs and resources. Their soft fur made them appealing companions, while their rapid reproduction made them practical food sources during difficult times. Even insects beyond crickets found their way into Chinese homes. Some people kept silkworms, not just for silk production, but as fascinating creatures to observe through their life cycles. Others maintained butterfly gardens or kept beetles prized for their unusual appearance. The diversity of pet ownership reflected Chinese philosophical ideas about harmony between humans and nature. Keeping various animals wasn't just about companionship, It was about creating miniature ecosystems that demonstrated proper relationships between different forms of life. These practices influenced pet ownership for centuries. The Chinese developed sophisticated understanding of animal behavior, breeding techniques, and care requirements that laid the groundwork for modern pet-keeping practices. But it wasn't just variety that characterized ancient Chinese pet ownership. It was the integration of these animals into daily life, cultural practices, and spiritual beliefs. Pets weren't separate from human society. They were part of it. Soap in ancient China was a lot like government policy at the time. Technically, advanced, occasionally effective, and likely to leave you questioning whether the cure was worse than the problem. It worked, sort of, but using it felt more like conducting a chemistry experiment than giving your pet a bath. The most common cleaning agents were plant-based: soap root, various nuts, and beans that produce natural saponins when mixed with water. When combined with hot water, these ingredients created a mildly soapy solution that could clean fur and skin without completely stripping away natural oils. Early pet cleaning solutions didn't come in convenient bottles with pictures of happy animals. They came in the form of crushed plants, ground nuts, and various powders that had to be mixed fresh each time. If you added herbs like mint, chrysanthemum, or sandalwood, you could convince yourself it was a luxury spa treatment, but mostly it just smelled like wet plants and effort. To make it, you needed patience and a strong stomach. Grind the soap root, mix with warm water, add aromatic herbs if available, and pray that your pet would cooperate long enough for the solution to do its job. The resulting mixture looked muddy, smelled herbal, and had the cleaning power of wishful thinking combined with mild chemical action. Soap was mainly used for special occasions and serious cleaning needs, not so much for regular maintenance. Pets were considered delicate, and harsh cleaning could disturb their spiritual balance or damage their fur. Still, people used these plant-based cleaners when necessary, especially before important events like festivals or when receiving important visitors. More refined cleaning solutions came from Buddhist monasteries and Taoist temples, where monks had developed gentle, effective cleaning methods as part of their compassionate care for temple animals. These religious communities often had access to higher quality ingredients and more sophisticated preparation techniques. But for most people, soap was a utility, not a pleasure. You used it to clean your pets when they were really dirty, when they smelled offensive, or when social expectations demanded it. It wasn't part of a regular grooming routine. It was an occasional necessity, like taking medicine or paying taxes. Some people went their whole lives using minimal soap on their pets and considered this perfectly normal, especially when surrounded by others doing exactly the same thing. Communal standards have a way of making even the most questionable practices seem reasonable. In ancient China, doing the pet's laundry wasn't just a chore. It was a meditation on the relationship between cleanliness, virtue, and the proper care of dependent creatures. Forget modern washing machines or specialized pet detergents. If you wanted clean pet bedding and accessories, you had to be willing to scrub, rinse, and negotiate with the weather gods for cooperation. Most pet textile cleaning was done in rivers, which sounds peaceful until you remember that these rivers also served as transportation routes, irrigation sources, and occasional dumping grounds for various household waste. But hey, running water is running water, and it was often the only option available. First you soaked pet bedding, clothing, and accessories in water mixed with plant-based cleaning agents or fermented solutions that helped break down oils and odours. The soaking process could take hours, depending on how dirty the items were and how patient you felt that day. After soaking, items were scrubbed against wooden boards or smooth stones, then pounded with paddles in a process that was part cleaning technique, part stress relief. This method could take considerable time and often involved multiple people working together. especially for larger items like pet blankets or elaborate costumes. Then came the rinsing, wringing, and drying, which, if it rained, meant waiting another day and hoping your pet's bedding didn't develop its own small civilization while you waited. Items were often spread across bamboo frames, hung on lines between buildings, or draped over garden structures. Of course, not everyone did their own pet laundry. Wealthy households had servants dedicated to textile care, while some urban areas had professional washers who specialized in cleaning household items, including pet accessories. Interestingly, clean pet belongings were often more important than clean pets themselves. You might not bathe your cat very often, but if its sleeping cushion was fresh and its collar was spotless, you were considered a responsible pet owner. In some cases, textile care was your primary pet hygiene strategy. Rather than struggling to bathe a reluctant animal, you could simply change its bedding, wash its clothing, and maintain a clean environment. It was often more practical and less stressful for everyone involved. After 14 chapters of grooming, cleaning, feeding, and surviving the daily challenges of ancient Chinese pet ownership, the question must finally be asked: did ancient Chinese pet care actually work? Or was everyone just one unwashed animal away from a household crisis? The short answer: it worked well enough. Not by modern standards, of course. If you were to time travel back to the Tang dynasty, your expectations for pet cleanliness and healthcare would probably need serious adjustment. But in their own context, ancient Chinese pet owners weren't completely clueless about animal welfare. They had systems, even if those systems involved herbal baths, silk clothing, and occasional prayers to various deities for their pets' continued health. They had tools, fine-toothed combs, plant-based cleaning solutions, and specialized diets based on traditional medicine principles. They had rituals too, whether it was the daily grooming session that doubled as meditation, the seasonal clothing changes that marked important festivals, or the careful attention to their pets' spiritual as well as physical needs. Hygiene existed. It was just deeply interwoven with philosophy, social status, and seasonal availability of resources. In many ways, ancient Chinese pet owners were doing the best they could with what they had, while also trying not to disturb cosmic harmony, offend ancestral spirits, or bankrupt themselves buying imported delicacies for their animals. The idea of daily pet baths was unnecessary and potentially harmful, thanks to beliefs about energy balance and the natural order. So they got inventive, and surprisingly, some practices aged well. Silk clothing for pets was hygienically smart. Herbal rinses and plant-based cleaning solutions showed solid understanding of natural antiseptic properties. Even the elaborate grooming rituals served important bonding and health monitoring functions. But yes, pets had odours, they dealt with parasites, they shared living spaces with multiple family members, and occasionally honoured guests. Yet many lived healthy lives and provided genuine companionship to their human families. So while their standards were different from ours, they weren't without effort or care. Pet hygiene was more of a philosophical practice than a scientific one. Clean animals reflected well on their owner's character, proper pet care demonstrated virtue and responsibility, and maintaining healthy pets was seen as a form of spiritual discipline. In the end, ancient Chinese pet care worked in the same way that traditional medicine works, partially sometimes, and often better than you'd expect given the limited resources available. Imagine walking through a city over 2,000 years old, the ancient capital of Chang'an during the Tang dynasty. If you were expecting chaotic streets filled with random pet owners struggling to manage their animals, think again. This place was so well organised, it could make a modern city planner weep with envy. Constructed around 618 CE, Chang'an wasn't thrown together like a medieval European town. It was meticulously planned. The city was laid out in a grid pattern, yes, actual blocks and right angles. Streets ran north to south and east to west, intersecting cleanly and forming a neat network of roads. It was as if the architects used a ruler and said, let's keep this geometric, and also let's designate specific areas for pet-related commerce. But the real magic wasn't just on the surface. Underneath those dusty roads was a system that even 21st century cities often fail to maintain. Designated areas for different types of activities, including pet care and animal commerce. Chang'an had specific districts for bird sellers, dog breeders, cricket dealers, and exotic animal importers. You could almost hear the ancient residents saying, yes, actually, urban planning for pet ownership matters. The city wasn't just a giant pet market with buildings, though. It was zoned with intention. There was the imperial city, where the emperor's own menagerie lived in climate-controlled pavilions. There was the commercial district, where ordinary citizens could purchase pets, food, and accessories. And there were residential areas with specific regulations about animal ownership, noise control, and waste management. Markets thrived along designated streets, and different animal dealers had their own specialised areas. The bird market was separate from the dog breeders, who were separate from the exotic animal importers. This wasn't just about organisation, it was about preventing the kind of chaos that occurs when you mix territorial roosters, hunting dogs, and imported monkeys in the same marketplace. Meanwhile, the mystery of how such a well-organised pet culture developed remains fascinating. Chang'an was eventually abandoned, not because of pet-related disasters or animal control problems, but because of political changes and economic shifts. But whatever the cause, the legacy of organised, thoughtful pet ownership endured. A city built with intention, intelligence, and a thorough understanding that proper animal care requires proper infrastructure. If Chang'an was the efficiently organised accountant of ancient pet-friendly cities, the imperial palace complexes were the theatrical celebrities, flashy, vast, and absolutely drenched in animal-related luxury. The Forbidden City wasn't just a residence, it was a symbol, and every pet within its walls was part of an elaborate performance of imperial power and refinement. The imperial palaces weren't just impressive, they were carefully orchestrated spaces designed to showcase the emperor's relationship with all forms of life, including his carefully curated collection of animals. Now, don't let the grandeur fool you. This place was as systematically planned as it was majestic. Palace complexes were designed with specific areas for different types of animals. There were pavilions for exotic birds, courtyards for rare dogs, pools for ornamental fish, and specialised buildings for whatever unusual creatures happened to catch the emperor's fancy, that particular dynasty. At the centre of the palace's animal-related activities was often a complex system of gardens, pools, and pavilions that served both practical and symbolic purposes. These weren't just pretty spaces, they were carefully designed environments that demonstrated the emperor's ability to maintain harmony between human civilization and the natural world. The Forbidden City featured elaborate aviaries, fish ponds with rare species, and designated areas for the emperor's hunting dogs and companion animals. Everything was connected by carefully planned pathways that allowed for imperial processions featuring both humans and animals. But palace pet keeping wasn't just about luxury, it was also about demonstrating political and spiritual authority. The emperor's collection of rare animals served as living proof of his empire's reach and his personal virtue. A well-maintained menagerie wasn't just impressive, it was propaganda. Palace veterinarians, animal trainers, and specialised caretakers formed their own bureaucratic departments with official ranks, salaries, and responsibilities. Taking care of the imperial pets wasn't just a job, it was a career path that could lead to significant social advancement. The palace complex was designed to impress both mortals and heaven itself. Every animal enclosure, every garden path, every decorative pool was part of a larger symbolic statement. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and marvel at my excellent pet care policies. Even the architecture bore inscriptions celebrating the emperor's relationship with his animals. Because if you're going to build elaborate facilities for your pets, you might as well make sure everyone knows about it. The legacy of imperial pet keeping influenced Chinese culture for centuries, establishing standards of animal care that trickled down through society and shaped how ordinary people thought about their own relationships with their pets. Roughly 1,000 years before Europeans were impressed by small dogs carried in sleeves, the Chinese were already developing sophisticated breeding programs that would make modern dog show enthusiasts weep with recognition. At its peak around 800 CE, the imperial breeding programs were producing some of the most refined animals in the world, with bloodlines tracked more carefully than minor nobility. The Chinese approach to animal breeding was deliberately systematic, guided by both aesthetic principles and practical considerations. This wasn't just about creating cute pets, it was about developing animals that embodied philosophical ideals and served specific purposes within Chinese society. The most iconic example was the development of the Pekingese dog breed. These tiny animals weren't just bred to be small and adorable, they were designed to be living symbols of imperial power that could literally be carried within the emperor's robes. Every aspect of their breeding, size, temperament, coat colour, facial features, was carefully controlled to create the perfect imperial companion. Now here's where things get more advanced. Chinese breeders understood genetics in a practical, if not scientific way. They kept detailed records of breeding pairs, tracked inherited traits across generations, and made breeding decisions based on careful observation of offspring. This wasn't random. It was systematically planned genetic manipulation centuries before anyone understood DNA. The breeding programs weren't limited to dogs. Chinese fish breeders developed goldfish varieties with elaborate fin shapes, unusual colours, and distinctive features. Bird breeders created singing canaries and exotic parrots with specific vocal abilities. Even cricket breeders developed different varieties prized for their fighting ability or the quality of their songs. These programs were sophisticated enough to involve multiple breeding facilities, careful record keeping, and specialized knowledge passed down through generations of animal husbandry experts. Some breeding lines were so valuable that they were considered state secrets, protected by imperial decree. The Chinese also understood the relationship between breeding and behavior. They didn't just breed for physical traits, they selected for temperament, intelligence, and specific behavioral characteristics that made animals better companions or more effective in their designated roles. This approach to animal breeding had profound effects on pet ownership throughout Chinese society. The availability of well-bred, predictable animals made pet ownership more appealing and practical for ordinary citizens, not just the imperial court. The techniques developed in these ancient breeding programs influenced animal husbandry practices throughout Asia and eventually spread to other parts of the world through trade and cultural exchange. When we talk about ancient pet ownership, it's tempting to imagine a single, wealthy patron making decisions about animal care. But in ancient China, pet keeping often emerged from cultural trends so strong that entire communities across different regions shared remarkably similar practices. These weren't isolated households with unusual animals. They were part of a civilization-wide approach to animal companionship. Take cricket keeping, which appeared simultaneously in multiple Chinese cities despite limited communication between regions. People from Guangzhou to Beijing were independently developing similar cricket care techniques, building comparable cages, and establishing nearly identical rules for cricket fighting competitions. This wasn't just coincidence, it was cultural DNA expressing itself through shared values and similar environmental pressures. The same pattern appeared with goldfish breeding, songbird care, and small dog ownership. These practices emerged organically from from Chinese philosophical principles about harmony, balance, and the proper relationship between humans and nature. Different cities developed similar solutions because they were working from the same cultural foundation. What makes this even more remarkable is that there's limited evidence of centralized control or imperial mandates governing pet ownership. The consistency seems to have emerged from shared cultural values, common educational traditions, and similar economic conditions rather than top-down regulation. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites suggests standardized pet care tools, similar architectural features for animal housing, and comparable burial practices for beloved pets. These similarities appeared across hundreds of miles and different political jurisdictions, indicating that pet ownership was truly integrated into Chinese cultural identity. The consistency extended to economic practices as well. Pet markets in different cities used similar pricing structures, offered comparable services, and maintained similar quality standards. This suggests that pet ownership was regulated by cultural norms and social expectations rather than formal laws. Even more interesting is the evidence that different social classes within the same communities shared basic approaches to pet care, even when the resources available to them varied dramatically. A wealthy merchant and a modest craftsman might keep very different animals, but their underlying care philosophies were remarkably similar. This cultural consistency helps explain why Chinese pet ownership practices were so durable and influential. They weren't just individual preferences or elite fashions, they were expressions of fundamental cultural values that persisted across generations and social changes. When we think of pet care today, we picture veterinarians arguing over proper nutrition and behavioural specialists debating training methods. But in ancient China, the equivalent discussions took place between Confucian scholars, Taoist philosophers, and Buddhist monks, each bringing their own perspectives to questions about the proper relationship between humans and animals. Let's start with the Confucians. For followers of Confucius, pet ownership was fundamentally about demonstrating virtue through proper care of dependent creatures. The way you treated your animals reflected your moral character and your fitness for social responsibility. A person who neglected their pets was considered unfit for positions of authority or trust. Confucian pet care emphasized routine, hierarchy, and mutual obligation. Pets had specific roles and responsibilities, just like family members. Dogs should guard the household, cats should control rodents, and ornamental fish should provide contemplative beauty. But humans had corresponding obligations to provide food, shelter, medical care, and emotional attention. The Confucian approach to pet training was based on consistent rules, clear expectations, and patient correction rather than punishment. Animals were expected to learn their place in the household hierarchy, but they were also entitled to protection and care from their human superiors. Then there were the Taoists, who brought a completely different perspective to pet ownership. For Taoists, the ideal relationship with animals was based on natural harmony rather than imposed discipline. Pets should be allowed to express their essential nature while living in balance with their human companions. Taoist pet care emphasized observation, adaptation, and minimal intervention. Instead of training animals to behave in specific ways, Taoist pet owners tried to understand each animal's natural tendencies and create environments where those tendencies could be expressed without causing problems. This approach led to some interesting practices, allowing cats to roam freely rather than confining them, feeding animals according to their natural preferences rather than enforced schedules, and treating behavioural problems through environmental changes rather than training or punishment. Buddhist influence on pet ownership was perhaps the most transformative. Buddhist principles of compassion, non-violence, and respect for all sentient beings elevated pet care from practical necessity to spiritual practice. Many Buddhists became vegetarians and refused to own animals that required meat-based diets, leading to increased popularity of fish, birds, and herbivorous mammals as pets. Buddhist pet care involved elaborate rituals for blessing animals, prayers for their health and happiness, and careful attention to their emotional and spiritual well-being. Some Buddhist pet owners believed that providing excellent care for animals could improve their own karma and potentially influence the animal's future reincarnations. The intersection of these three philosophical traditions created a uniquely Chinese approach to pet ownership that balanced practical considerations with moral, spiritual, and aesthetic concerns. Pet care wasn't just about keeping animals healthy, it was about maintaining cosmic harmony and demonstrating human virtue. We love to imagine the ancient world as chaotic and primitive, but the truth is that some ancient Chinese cities had pet-related infrastructure that would make modern urban planners envious. In fact, several cities had public hygiene systems that included provisions for animal waste management, designated pet exercise areas, and even public facilities for animal care. Let's return to Chang'an, our infrastructure superstar. Nearly every neighbourhood had designated areas for animal waste disposal, wells specifically for animal watering, and public spaces where pet owners could exercise their animals and socialise with other pet enthusiasts. These weren't just conveniences, they were engineered solutions to the challenges of urban pet ownership. The city had covered waste collection systems that included provisions for animal waste, which was often processed separately from human waste and used for agricultural purposes outside the city walls. It was basically an early version of municipal pet waste management, designed to prevent public health problems while recycling organic matter. Compare that to Kaifeng during the Song dynasty, where pet ownership was integrated into urban planning from the beginning. The city had specific regulations about animal noise, waste disposal, and public behaviour. Pet owners were expected to clean up after their animals, control excessive barking or other disturbances, and ensure that their pets didn't damage public property or interfere with commerce. Still, animal facilities were common in both cities. Public buildings often had provision for animal care, and wealthy households maintained private courtyards designed specifically for pet exercise and socialisation. Some residential complexes even had shared animal care facilities, where neighbours could coordinate pet sitting and veterinary care. But what makes all of this impressive isn't just the technology, it's the mindset. These civilizations viewed urban animal management not just as a luxury for the elite, but as a necessity for civilized society. Proper pet care was embedded in their concepts of urban planning and public health. Modern cities still struggle with pet waste management, noise control, and zoning for animal-related businesses. These ancient Chinese cities had addressed many of these challenges over 1,000 years ago, using gravity, careful planning, and social cooperation instead of complex technology. The success of these urban animal management systems depended on widespread cultural agreement about the importance of pet ownership and the responsibilities that came with it. When most citizens shared similar values about animal care, municipal systems could function efficiently without extensive enforcement or elaborate regulations. If temples were where ancient Chinese people spoke to the gods, pet markets were where they negotiated with each other over the price of companionship, and likely argued over whether that songbird was really worth 3 months' salary. Every major ancient Chinese city had a beating commercial heart, and that heart pulsed with the activity of animal dealers, pet accessory makers, and specialized pet service providers. In Chang'an, pet markets weren't chaotic afterthoughts squeezed between food vendors. They were institutionalized, woven into the urban economy, and regulated by merchant guilds. the Song dynasty's commercial code, one of the most comprehensive trade regulation systems in the ancient world, devoted significant attention to animal commerce, pet breeding standards, and consumer protection for pet buyers. Pet markets bustled with activity under covered pavilions and in specialized courtyard complexes. Exotic birds from Southeast Asia, rare dog breeds from Central Asia, ornamental fish in ceramic containers, and crickets in elaborate bamboo cages changed hands, while scribes recorded transactions and maintained breeding records. This wasn't just shopping, it was commerce with detailed documentation and quality assurance. Now shift to Kaifeng during the Northern Song period, where things get even more sophisticated. The city hosted enormous pet market plazas, especially during seasonal festivals, when thousands gathered to buy, sell, and trade animals. Unlike highly centralized palace-controlled breeding programs, Kaifeng's pet markets were decentralized and community-driven, with different neighborhoods specializing in specific types of animals. Think of it as an ancient version of specialized pet stores, except your local cricket dealer lived in the neighborhood and probably knew your family's pet preferences going back 3 generations. Meanwhile, in port cities like Guangzhou, pet markets took on an international character. Goods from India, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia included rare animals, exotic pet accessories, and specialized care products. Traders would accept Chinese silk in exchange for rare parrots, or trade precious metals for breeding pairs of unusual fish. But it wasn't just about buying and selling animals. Pet markets were social institutions where people exchanged care advice, arranged breeding partnerships, and established long-term relationships with suppliers. In smaller cities, the local animal dealer often served as an informal veterinarian, pet trainer, and breeding consultant. These markets drove innovation in animal care, created employment for thousands of people, and established China as a center for animal breeding and pet-related commerce that's influenced trade throughout Asia. Behind every well-cared-for pet and flourishing animal market was a merchant willing to pay premium prices for high-quality breeding stock, and a customer base sophisticated enough to distinguish between ordinary animals and exceptional ones. In the ancient world, pet ownership wasn't just about individual families deciding to keep animals. It was often integrated into religious and spiritual practices, with temples, monasteries, and sacred sites maintaining their own animal populations as part of their spiritual mission. Buddhist temples were particularly notable for their approach to animal care. Many maintained populations of cats to control rodents, dogs for protection, and various birds that were considered auspicious or spiritually significant. But these weren't just practical arrangements, they were expressions of Buddhist compassion and respect for all sentient beings. Temple cats and dogs often lived better than pets in ordinary households. They received regular meals, medical attention from monks trained in traditional medicine, and even specialized care during illness or old age. Some temples maintained detailed records of their animal populations, including names, health conditions, and behavioral characteristics. Taoist monasteries took a different approach, often maintaining animals that were believed to have spiritual significance or healing properties. Some kept cranes, which were associated with longevity and wisdom. Others maintained fish ponds with species believed to bring good fortune or promote meditation. These religious institutions also served as centers for animal care education. Monks and priests often had extensive knowledge of herbal medicine, animal behavior, and breeding techniques. They shared this knowledge with lay practitioners and contributed to the overall improvement of animal care practices in their communities. Some temples operated as informal animal hospitals, providing care for sick or injured pets belonging to local residents. This wasn't just charity, it was seen as a form of spiritual practice that benefited both the animals and the humans who cared for them. The integration of animal care into religious practice also influenced burial customs and memorial practices for pets. Some temples maintained special areas for pet burials, complete with memorial tablets and regular ceremonies honouring deceased animals. Religious animal care practices also influenced secular pet ownership by establishing standards of compassion, attention to animal welfare, and respect for the bonds between humans and their animal companions. These spiritual approaches to animal care helped create a cultural foundation that supported more humane and thoughtful pet ownership practices throughout Chinese society. It's tempting to think of modern cities as products of recent innovation and contemporary urban planning, but dig a little deeper, and you'll find that many fundamental aspects of urban pet management were already established thousands of years ago by planners without modern technology or formal training in animal behaviour. The principles of pet-friendly urban design, designated spaces for different activities, waste management systems, regulation of animal-related commerce, and integration of animal care into community life were already etched into the layout of ancient Chinese cities by people who understood that successful cities required successful solutions to the challenges of human-animal coexistence. Take waste management. Chang'an didn't just throw together a few collection points and hope for the best. They designed an integrated system that separated different types of waste, processed organic matter for agricultural use, and maintained public health standards. The concept of municipal responsibility for animal waste management was a standard feature of urban planning, not an innovative experiment. Kaifeng pioneered the idea of commercial zoning for animal-related businesses. Specialized markets, breeding facilities, and pet service providers weren't scattered randomly throughout the city. They were deliberately located to serve residential areas efficiently while preventing conflicts with other types of commerce. And then there's the social infrastructure. Ancient Chinese cities developed community practices around pet ownership that helped prevent problems and supported responsible animal care. Neighbourhood organisations, informal cooperation between pet owners, and shared responsibility for public spaces created social systems that made urban pet ownership practical and enjoyable. Modern urban planning owes much to these ancient insights. The importance of designated spaces for animal exercise, the need for effective waste management, the value of specialised commercial districts, and the necessity of community cooperation in managing shared urban environments. We still zone cities for different activities, we still struggle with pet waste management, and we still work to balance the needs of pet owners with the concerns of non-pet owning residents. What's changed is the technology, not the fundamental principles. And while we design cities with cars and digital infrastructure, the core insights about human-animal relationships in urban environments remain remarkably consistent. Cities are stories we write in concrete, glass and steel, and the first chapters of urban pet management were carved with traditional tools, planned with careful observation, and sustained by people who believed that good cities required good solutions to the practical challenges of daily life. So the next time you walk down a city street with your pet, remember, you're not just moving through space designed for modern life. You're participating in urban traditions that stretch back thousands of years, quietly continuing conversations about human-animal relationships that began in ancient Chinese cities and continue in every municipal dog park and pet waste station today. The story of pets in ancient China isn't just about individual animals or specific care practices. It's about a civilization that developed sophisticated, lasting approaches to the relationships between humans and animals. Approaches that influence not just pet ownership, but agriculture, urban planning, philosophy, and art. From the imperial breeding programs that created new varieties of animals, to the neighborhood markets where ordinary citizens could purchase companionship, ancient China created a template for integrating animal care into human society that remains influential today. Their success came not from superior technology or unlimited resources, but from cultural values that prioritized harmony, responsibility, and respect for all forms of life. They understood that caring for animals wasn't just about individual satisfaction, it was about creating a more balanced and civilized society. The legacy of ancient Chinese pet ownership continues in modern practices. Selective breeding techniques, urban planning that accommodates animals, philosophical approaches to human-animal relationships, and the simple recognition that the way we treat our pets reflects our character and values. In the end, ancient Chinese pet care worked because it was based on lasting principles: observation, patience, respect, and the understanding that humans and animals can create relationships that benefit both species. These principles transcended dynasties, survived social changes, and continue to guide pet ownership today. The next time you groom your pet, train a new puppy, or simply enjoy the companionship of an animal, you're participating in traditions that stretch back thousands of years to ancient Chinese households, where people first discovered that caring for animals could be both practical necessity and profound pleasure. Their story reminds us that some aspects of human nature, our capacity for compassion, our need for companionship, and our ability to create bonds across species, remain remarkably consistent across time and culture. In ancient China, as today, pets weren't just animals. They were family members, companions, and reminders of our connection to the natural world. And that perhaps is the most enduring lesson from the long history of pets in ancient China, that the relationships we form with animals reflect not just our individual choices, but our deepest values about care, responsibility, and what it means to live well in the world.